I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as Russia shifts its battlefield priority in the Donbas, we hear how Putin has proclaimed the start of a new world order, as his allies rush to sign up to a Kremlin-led economic club at a summit in Russia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 24th of October, 2 years and 249 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant, and Yuriy Boyechko, Chief Exec and founder of Hope for Ukraine. But I'll start with the updates. Now, Russian forces seem to have shifted their focus in the Donbas. The last few months we've been observing and been told, it was very clear from Putin and the Russian system, that Pokrovsk was their operational objective in the Donbas. They were piling on out of Donetsk city area. There was a big bulge coming out of the Donetsk city area towards Pokrovsk. It looked as if the city was going to fall. And then when the Russian forces got to within about 10, 12, 15 Ks-ish, Ukraine managed to establish a hard shoulder. Now, Russian forces continued small advances in the area over the last few weeks, particularly on the left flank of the bulge, so to the sort of southwest and the south coming out of Donetsk. It now looks like they are prioritising that left flank, aiming to take or at least encircle the town of Solidovay. That's about 15 k's south-southeast of Pokrovsk. There's geolocated footage from the last couple of days showing Russian forces in the northeast and the east of Solidovay. Now, the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, they cite a Russian mill blogger and former Storm Z instructor as saying that despite the widely understood value of Pokrovsk to Russia, that mill blogger is saying, quote, the process is stalling. The mill blogger said the Russian command's fixation on the southern flank of Pokrovsk has led to a spreading of forces and resources, and that has resulted in excessive Russian infantry losses and afforded Ukrainian troops additional time to further fortify Pokrovsk itself. I mean, that may well be what we've seen. Now, we think Ukrainian forces still have control of the main road and the rail lines running into and beyond Pokrovsk. So losing Solidovay, whilst of course bad, you never want to be going backwards, that's not going to massively undermine the effectiveness of the Pokrovsk defence. So looking at this, I wonder if the Russian forces are reinforcing what they view as success. Now, I've said this many times before, you reinforce success, you don't reinforce failure. They might be seeing that they're having these small, very tactical successes on that left flank, on the sort of southern and southwestern side of that bulge, so they've kind of kept going. Now, reinforcing success is good, but you shouldn't do it just for the sake of it, and especially if it exhausts your troops and sees more men and equipment destroyed, which in turn means it's harder to concentrate on your actual operational objective. So if they want to take Pokrovsk, which they've said they do, and all the evidence is that they do, I wonder if by seemingly reinforcing the limited success they're having on that left flank is actually not really going to achieve a huge amount. They'll take some ground, of course, but if it comes at the exhaustion and denudes the main effort in that area, then you've got to ask, is it worth it? Now, connected to that, Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office said earlier today that Russian soldiers had murdered another 4 captured service personnel. This came from the Ukrainian National Guard. They were said to have been taken prisoner in Solidovay after an attack on October the 6th. Russian soldiers are said to have filmed their interrogations, so we know they were captured alive. But when the positions were recaptured by Ukrainian forces on October the 7th, the bodies of these 4 individuals were discovered. Now, elsewhere, very little movement on the line up and down, and including in Kursk. I think in Kursk, Russia is basically waiting for the North Koreans to turn up. It's been nearly 3 months now, August the 6th, I think, the first move into Kursk Oblast. Nearly 3 months now, and there are still thousands of Ukrainian troops holding Russian land. Moscow has not shown the ability, and very little will actually, but certainly not the ability to dislodge them. It's suggested that that's what these North Korean troops are going to be thrown into. So I think they're just hunkering down now, Russia. Elsewhere across the country, Ukrainian forces shot down 40 of 50 Shahed-type and other unidentified drones launched by Russia overnight. That comes from Ukraine's Air Force. 7 more drones were lost, which we take to mean by electronic warfare. 2 others flew back towards Russia and Belarus. Russian forces also fired 2 Kh-22 and 2 Kh-59 missiles into Ukraine. Now, I just mentioned the North Koreans again. Obviously, we've been talking about it for quite some time now as an issue, but the Pentagon and White House confirmed the deployment of North Korean troops to Russia. US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said yesterday that the US government has evidence that there are North Korean troops in Russia, although numbers, roles, dispositions, future intentions exactly unclear. That obviously chimes with what British Defence Secretary John Healey said yesterday at the Trinity House event I went to, where he and his German counterpart Boris Pistorius signed that new defence pact. Now, US National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby has been speaking on the issue. Yesterday, he said of the North Koreans, quote, "If they do deploy to fight against Ukraine, they're fair game." I don't like the word game. It's not a game, but anyway, I get the analogy. If they do deploy to fight against Ukraine, they're fair game, they're fair targets, and the Ukrainian military will defend themselves against North Korean soldiers the same way they're defending themselves against Russian soldiers. John Kirby said Washington believes North Korea has moved at least 3,000 soldiers into eastern Russia. We assess that these soldiers travel by ship from the Wan area in North Korea to Vladivostok in Russia. These soldiers then travelled onward to multiple Russian military training sites in eastern Russia, where they are currently undergoing training. General Kyrylo Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, he said yesterday that the first North Korean units were expected to arrive in Kursk either yesterday or today. Now then, in a tweet I saw earlier on today, Michael Turner, who's the chairman of the US Select Committee on Intelligence, said the US should, in his words, seriously consider taking direct military action against North Korean troops if they join the war. He put a tweet out last night, I saw it this morning, that said, now that Secretary Austin has finally acknowledged that North Korean troops are in Russia, preparing to enter the conflict with Ukraine, the Biden-Harris administration must make clear that North Korean troops entering the conflict are a red line for the United States. I've long challenged the Biden-Harris administration's unwise position on restricting Ukraine's use of US weapons against targets within Russian territory. If North Korean troops attack Ukraine from Russian territory, Ukraine should be permitted to use American weapons to respond. If North Korean troops were to invade Ukraine's sovereign territory, the United States needs to seriously consider taking direct military action against the North Korean troops. So pretty bombastic there from Mr. Turner. If he's your representative, let me know what you think. But Francis, so it's all heating up on the North Korean front. That really has chucked a spanner in the whole diplomacy in the last few days. It's really sort of been a feature of the diplomatic circuit in the last week or so. It probably wouldn't have got a mention at the BRICS summit, but lots else did. What have you been looking at?
Well, thanks, Dom. I'll come to North Korea in a moment because you say it's been really one of the key points of conversation around the world in the last couple of days. As for BRICS, I think it has the appearance at this stage, and of course it's still ongoing, of being quite a diplomatic success for the Russians. We were talking about it this morning here in Telegraph Towers, looking at the optics of it, not just with the attendance of the UN Secretary General, but with that of so many world leaders, including those of India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And that's before one considers the representatives of other countries who are also there. As we discussed yesterday, Putin is trying to sell this as being a definitive step towards the so-called multipolar world, going as far as to explicitly express in his remarks that this is the start of a new world order. Footage shows the leaders all standing together and at various points engaging in intimate dialogues with each other, including Xi and Putin. That's led to a little bit of commentary this morning. It is worth saying, though, that just because these leaders are in attendance, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are firmly behind Putin's war in Ukraine. It's quite interesting. President Xi reiterated China's long-standing position, calling for de-escalation and discouraged the involvement of third parties in the war, amid reports of North Korean troops being deployed to Ukraine. Now, it's quite possible that it is simply the public position of Beijing and that they have mandated it behind closed doors. But the fact that they felt they needed to say that, I think, is interesting. Modi of India's remarks were also quite telling, I think, and I quote, "We must be careful to ensure that this organisation, i.e. BRICS, does not acquire the image of one that is trying to replace global institutions." Now that underscores his trying to balance ties with Russia, which of course India relies on for cheap oil, and the US, which is providing access to technology and quite sizable investment. China and India are also on a path to normalising relations after their border standoff of recent years, and we understand Modi and China are planning to hold meetings with representatives today. Now, there will be much more to say on this summit in a moment, but over the coming days, not least following the meeting the UN chief and Putin, I think we should be paying special attention to the spill-out conversations that are taking place after the fact, which may be just as revealing. And in that vein, the BBC's Steve Rosenberg has had a conversation with President Lukashenko of Belarus at the sidelines of the summit. And Lukashenko was asked explicitly by him about the reports of North Korean troops being deployed by Russia in Ukraine. His response, and I quote, "That's rubbish. That would mean an escalation of the conflict. Knowing his character, Putin would never try to involve a country's army in the Ukraine conflict." Well, Lukashenko might be in for a nasty shock, if he's being honest there. Both Ukraine and South Korea have said that Pyongyang's troops have been given false documents, identifying them as Buryat, the indigenous group in Siberia, to allow Moscow and Pyongyang plausible deniability about those troops' involvement. North Korea's state media agency has also released a response to Seoul's allegations from Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong-un, in which she accused South Korea and Ukraine of going about begging and letting loose reckless remarks against nuclear weapon states at random without follow-up capability. As the Financial Times report, she described the two countries as bad dogs bred by the US, adding that a military provocation against a nuclear weapons state may lead to a horrible situation, unimaginable for politicians and military experts in any big or small country in the world with their normal thinking to expertise. It's rather like those arguments I think you see in soap operas when someone has been caught cheating and they immediately blame the other person, except the cheater has nukes in that analogy. But anyway, it's just fascinating seeing the way that they resort so often to the saber rattling as soon as you point out anything, whether that be Russia, whether that be North Korea, whether that be China to a certain degree too. Now, just on that subject of nukes, Steve Rosenberg did put the subject of those weapons stationed in Belarus to Lukashenko, and he replied, "Putin will never use those weapons stationed in Belarus without my consent. I am absolutely ready to use them, but only if the boot of one foreign soldier steps into Belarus." Interesting. But back to the summit, and what will be seen by many as a rather bitter irony. Today is UN Day, 79 years since the adoption of the UN Charter. Yet the UN spokespeople are getting some very tough questions thrown their way about their chief's attendance in Russia. Now, Dom, just to give listeners a sense of that and the way that the UN is trying to navigate this incredibly delicate situation, over to you to play the journalists asking the question of the spokesman, and I will play the spokesman. No silly accents, please, well, unless you want to. But I think the reply is very revealing.
I'm role-playing as a professional journalist.
Yeah, you are role-playing as a professional journalist.
Excuse me. Yeah. La 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 la. Hair and makeup done. Is the Secretary-General going to be delivering an address there at the BRICS summit? Is he planning to meet with President Xi of China, President Putin of Russia, and India's President Modi?
Well, regarding the schedule, yes, he does intend to meet with a large number of the leaders attending the summit. That, of course, will depend upon what can be arranged, but certainly that's one of the main reasons why he's attending the BRICS summit. As for the remarks, yes, he will deliver remarks and we'll share them with you once he's delivered those.
Thank you. The question is about Secretary-General's trip to Kazan as well. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine said the following. The UN Secretary-General rejected Ukraine's invitation to the first Global Peace Summit in Switzerland. He has, however, accepted an invitation to Kazan from war criminal Putin. This is a wrong choice. That doesn't contribute to the cause of peace. It only damages the reputation of the UN. So my question, what does Mr. Guterres want to convey to Putin during the meeting in Kazan?
Well, let me take the two bits separately. The part about his attendance and the part about his meeting with President Putin. First of all, with attendance, the Secretary-General is attending the BRICS summit, as he did previously in South Africa, and as he does as a standard practice in attending meetings of organisations with large numbers of important member states, such as the G7 and the G20. There's a meeting with great importance for the work of the United Nations, with the BRICS countries representing about half of the world's population. And the Secretary-General will take the opportunity to hold a number of bilateral meetings with the leaders attending the summit. Now, regarding what you said about the meeting with President Putin, the Secretary-General will reaffirm his well-known positions on the war in Ukraine and the conditions for just peace based on the UN Charter, international law and the resolutions of the United Nations.
How come you didn't announce the Secretary-General's trip to the BRICS in advance? I mean, it's as you said, he's gone previously. You always announce when he's going to the G7 and the G20. You were asked about this in previous days by reporters in this room. So why the secrecy around this if it's a standard thing?
Meetings are in flux until they're not. And in this case, we were able to announce it now.
So he was not planning to go until now?
There were a lot of balls in the air.
Mercifully, that's the end of all that stuff. But what's your analysis of that little back and forth with the deputy spokesman for the UN Secretary-General, Francis?
Well, it was a lot of balls in the air. I think the reason it's worth hearing that is just to underscore the fact that they didn't announce this in advance. They deliberately wanted it to go under the radar with comparison to other major summits that the UN head would attend. And that in and of itself is extremely revealing. The UN know that this is rather, how do we put it, incendiary from the perspective of certain parties, but they proceeded with it, and those are the justifications there as to exactly why they've gone ahead with it. But whether that will be seen as satisfactory will, remain to be seen. It's going to be extremely interesting what Guterres says today. But that's enough from me. I think Roland also has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, Roland, keen to hear your thoughts on that. And then you've been looking at some stuff from the Duma as well. So let's start with BRICS. What have you been? What's your observation there?
Yeah, I think the remarks President Modi of India made that Francis flagged are kind of significant in that they do underline this is not a bloc that is entirely on one page, right? You have multiple leaders with multiple quite different kind of attitudes to the world and different priorities kind of on their plate, which is true, I suppose, of any international forum. But I suppose, that's the beauty of Vladimir Putin's multipolar world. You have lots of poles and lots of people kind of with other things on their air. So whereas you can kind of see the way kind of Russia is talking about this and Putin is talking about this and presenting this, like the Russians are seeing almost everything in a strong sense through the prism of the war in Ukraine and by extension the global confrontation with the West. And you have, other people with other kind of headaches. So you have President Modi warning, look, we can't make this look like an alternative world order that is going to replace everything else. You have President Xi repeating his official cautious kind of words. That's one thing to take note of. But I think Francis is right. This is quite a big win for the Russians, really. Given that 2.5 years ago, Vladimir Putin was meant to be completely and utterly isolated. You do now, whether you like it or not, you have a gathering of, as that UN spokesperson said, a gathering of leaders who represent about 45% of the world's population, really serious big hitters, Xi Jinping among them, President Modi among them. Yeah, if I was to play devil's advocate, the UN Secretary-General's advocate, you'd say, he kind of has to be there, right? Whether we like it or not. That is not a kind of gathering of world leaders that the world's chief diplomat can ignore. He kind of has to be there, and he has to be in the room, because otherwise he's just not doing his job. That is a symptom of how effective, I'm not saying entirely kind of successful, but at least in some way Russia's attempts to regain some kind of diplomatic clout have been. How far this develops in terms of concrete decision making, I mean, Vladimir Putin yesterday echoed that. He's made two kind of concrete proposals as far as I can make out. One is an alternative currency, an alternative reserve currency, an alternative trading system to kind of ease the world's reliance on the US dollar. That is a perennial thing. I can't really see that. I mean, perennial in the sense that it's something that he's mentioned before. I can't really see that taking off anytime soon. The other thing he talked about was about actually reforming the United Nations. He gave this long speech, actually with President Guterres in the room, looking rather stony-faced as he listened in through his interpreter's earpiece, in which Vladimir Putin said things that we've got used to hearing, actually, from all kinds of quarters, including from London, saying that the United Nations is outdated. Countries like Africa are underrepresented. You can look at the shift in economics, and we absolutely have to reform the structure of the whole thing. And that is something you'll hear diplomats in the British Foreign Office say as well. And the reason Britain says it and Russia says it is because they're both competing for the sympathies, the alliance, the ear of it's a clumsy work term, I don't like it, but for want of a better term, the global south. Right, the unaligned world, the emerging economies in Africa, in South America, parts of Asia, those countries that are not necessarily part of the quote-unquote global West, nor necessarily allied strongly with Russia, Iran, North Korea and their kind of standoff or global confrontation with the West. But there's definitely a competition here for those countries' loyalties and friendships, shall we say, and I think you definitely have to give the Russians a little bit of credit here. I think this summit does show that they're making a bit of progress here, and you can talk about things like the erosion of funding for the BBC World Service and things like that across Africa. You can definitely see where the West collectively is falling short in that great big competition. The other thing I'd like to draw out, there's real big diplomacy going on here, right? And we're not just talking about Russia and Ukraine stuff, right? So when you've got, Xi Jinping and President Modi and South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa in a room, there's a lot going on. And just as an example of that, Masoud Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, he sat down with Mohammed bin Zayed, the current president of the UAE, yesterday on a sofa. We don't know much of the details of what was said, although we know they did talk about these 3 islands that Iran has. UAE says they are illegally occupied by Iran. It's something that has always been a sticking point, a point of tension between the two countries, and that you'd always expect to come up when they talk. But Mohammed bin Zayed has always been a hawk on Iran. He's never met an Iranian president before. The Emirates were a really big supporter of Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Really opposed the nuclear deal, all of that. They're traditionally Iran hawks. And this kind of thing, it signifies a general kind of trend. It's not new. It's people who've been following the Middle East who have seen this over, the past year or months or so on. The Gulf Arab states generally walking a very fine line between Israel and Iran in the current Middle East conflict. I know I'm getting a little bit away from Ukraine here, but we're now talking about a global, really big global stuff is linked into the Frontline and Donbas in a way. And it kind of signifies how assumptions about the state of the world are changing. And I remember speaking to a Emirati, I think retired diplomat, a bigwig from that part of the world, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, where this particular person said, that's been a bit of a wake-up call for us, and we're realizing that America is perhaps not as reliable an ally as once thought, and therefore it's worth kind of hedging your bets. So there's that general feeling, I think, in lots of countries kind of outside the West or in between Russia and the West, that it's worth hedging one's bets. That's why a lot of them have shown up in Kazan. It's also why you would see these sunny Gulf kingdoms we traditionally think of as very hostile to Iran, who some people have talked about as being natural allies of Israel and the United States against Iran, are actually a bit of dialogue on either side rather than getting drawn into a potential conflict. And I know I'm talking about a different region, a different theatre of the world, but that is the kind of global dynamic here that Vladimir Putin is very, very much playing on, very, very much hoping that he's gonna develop into his new world order. Whether he's successful on that or not, time will tell.
Yeah, no, I accept that, and I accept that there's a lot of other bits and pieces going on in the margins. Interesting you say that SOFA meeting, Iran and UAE. I just think that if this is a club for grown-ups, then I think the UN should do more. My views are well known on the UN, and you're right, possibly there does need to be some official representation at some level. But if you look at the UN's website and all the news and the recent statements, and that's where I found all that stuff earlier on from the deputy spokesman, all the information that the UN puts out there around the individual different parts of the UN's work, the World Food Programme and on the refugee side of life, there's some regular commentary about Ukraine, about the deplorable international illegal invasion by Russia, etc., etc., etc. So all these words are there. But then when you look at the Secretary-General's personal communications, I put a tweet out last night, and I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but the last 3 messages that the UN Secretary-General put out was in response to the terrorist attack yesterday in Turkey, something about elections in Kurdistan, and giving a big up to World Tsunami Awareness Day. So he didn't mention the BRICS summit at all, didn't mention Kazan, didn't say, I'm going to go because I'm the head of the UN, but I will be making the following representations to all parties, blah, blah, blah. There was no diplomatic acknowledgement of it whatsoever. And I think that came out in that little back and forth with Francis earlier on from the deputy spokesman for the Secretary-General's office. They know that this is all a bit smelly. And that comment there from that reporter saying, well, you've told us well in advance about the G7 and the G20 and all this kind of stuff. Why didn't you tell us about this one? And he said, oh, no, this is just, what did he say? There were balls in the air. Meetings are in flux until they're not. I mean, a spokesperson is there to make things clear.
No, they're not. How long have you been a journalist? Spokespeople are there to give you the line and muddy things. You know that. Anyway, I take your point.
But coming out with stuff like meetings are in flux until they're not, and in this case we're able to announce it now. I mean, it's just rubbish. They knew it was a bit smelly, and I think they should have done more. Right, we need to move on because we've got hope for Ukraine waiting in the corner. But Roland, you wanted to say something about the Duma, I think.
Oh, sorry, yes. No, this is on the North Korean thing. So this morning the State Duma has ratified the Mutual Defence Pact with North Korea, which would legalise the deployment of North Korean troops to, quote-unquote, defend Russia from attack. So that's the lower house. The upper house, that's the Federation Council, will probably follow suit. So that is going to be the legal rubber stamping on this presumed, what we think now looks like is going to happen, a deployment of North Korean troops. This is under the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. That's what it's called. The agreement signed between Putin and Kim Jong-un and Pyongyang in June. And that, just a reminder for listeners, it obliges Russia and North Korea to immediately provide military assistance using all means either is attacked. It's the strongest link between, North Korea and Russia since the end of the Cold War. And just very, very quickly, in terms of what the North Koreans get out of this, we can see what the Russians do. There's lots of speculation. Kirill Budanov, the head of the GUR, told The Economist the other day, or he claimed, and I don't think he really presented any concrete evidence of this, that North Korea is going to get some nuclear technologies, including technologies for low-yield tactical nuclear weapons and submarine-launched missile systems. We don't have any proof of that. There's also some commentary in the Financial Times today saying, look, the bottom line is, Kim Jong-un will get leverage over Russia in this. It is something he can use to extract some kind of benefit, whether that does involve nuclear technology or missile systems, we don't know, but we'd expect him to get other things. But the big thing to note is, look, this pact goes both ways. Russia is also obliged to provide assistance to North Korea in the event of war. And really, on paper, whether or not that's going to happen, that has to change people's conceptions of what a war, a heating up of that long frozen ceasefire line on the Korean Peninsula might look like. So bottom line, rather serious and profound implications, not only for Europe, but for the Korean Peninsula and the Western Pacific as well.
Thanks, Roland. Now, let's turn to Yuriy Boyechko, CEO, Chief Executive and founder of Hope for Ukraine, an organisation working to protect, feed and shelter those impacted by this war. Very welcome to the pod. We haven't looked at the humanitarian side for a little while ago, so we're very keen to hear from you. Now, Yuriy, you say that at its core, Hope for Ukraine is not just about survival, it's about restoring dignity, rebuilding communities and rekindling hope in the hearts of the Ukrainian people. Those are big aspirations. Where do you start? We're very welcome, Yuriy. And first of all, where are you? Where are we talking to you from? Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining from the United States, from New Jersey. So that's where we're based. So thanks for having me. We've been working in Ukraine on the ground since 2016. Hope for Ukraine was started as a response to initial annexation by Russia of Crimea and part of Donbas region. At that time, we already started working with a lot of internal displaced people, trying to find them shelter, finding jobs, and trying to help rebuild their lives. After full-scale invasion, our work on the ground 10x as far as our response. Right now, our main areas of work is we provide emergency food kits each week to families in frontline areas. So right now we are providing about 1,500 food kits to families near the front line. Also, we run internal display center in Lviv, Ukraine, where we take in folks who run from frontline zones. We place them there. They stay there until we find them a permanent place to live, whether it's in Ukraine or if they choose to move to a European country or US, we assist with that as well. And also our main big focus also on education, providing after-school opportunities for kids in Ukraine. After school, most of them have single parents now. So we're trying to create these different opportunities, arts and crafts, music, tutoring to help them during this terrible time that they have to live through. So our ultimate goal is to make sure that after all said and done, after this terrible war is finished, that we are able to rebuild homes, build schools, and just build a prosperous future for the families who've been affected by this war in Ukraine.
Thanks, Yuriy. Now, we've spoken at length about the war that Russia's waging against the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And of course, we are about to enter the wet season and winter. So what are the biggest challenges you're facing at the moment on the ground? And can you share some insights about the most urgent need for the people you're trying to help? Any specific areas where aid is most critical?
I mean, one of the top requests we're getting right now is firewood. I would never think that would be an item that we would be talking in this day and age. But so far, we have delivered over 10 big semis of firewood to regions in Kherson, some parts in Sumy region, Kharkiv region, where people don't have electricity and heat. So right now, basically, these areas, they've been thrown back 50 years as far as where they are right now. So, have folks who've been without electricity and light and any stable deliveries of regular, even groceries for years right now. So the longer this war going on, I think the more suffering regular civilians are facing, especially in frontline towns, because you just never know what every day will bring. So right now, our main focus, we supplying a lot of firewood and also potatoes. In Ukraine, potatoes is a second most important staple that people eat. So right now, so far this year, we've delivered almost 200 tons of potatoes to frontline families to make sure that these folks have firewood to keep them warm as the temperature drops, and also they have something to eat, even if there's no regular delivery of groceries coming in.
Thank you, Yuriy. It's Francis here in London. Just wondered what your charity's work finds in terms of first-hand accounts. Is it often people who are perhaps elderly? Is it people who are of all ages, all genders? I'm just interested in whether you've got any first-hand accounts that you can share with us of the kind of individuals that you're helping.
I think the 85% of the population we serve are single mothers that raise kids, and then also elderly. I think elderly has been affected by this war tremendously because they're the ones who have no means. Like, that's why when we go, we do a lot of evacuation trips as well. We have folks who just have no means to get out. If you have a pension that's like $150 a month or $200 a month, you cannot do much with that, right? So they usually stay in these half-destroyed houses, apartment buildings, living in the basements for months and months at a time, because they basically have no means to leave. When we try to, rescue them, even from very bad areas, the one question they always ask, what I'm going to do? You're going to take me to some place where I don't know anyone, I don't have any money to live on. At least here, I know the surroundings, so I need to hold up and hopefully ride through this storm. So that's basically the population that we help the most. Also, a lot of the internal displaced families. Right now, we can pull up the truck with food kits to any town where there's a big internal displaced population. The truck will be cleared in a matter of 2 hours, because in the beginning of the war, I believe people, had more hope and had more like plans ahead. Okay, they were thinking, okay, this is going to be finished and we can go back to our normal lives. Now, 2 years plus, most of them still find themselves in the same place. There's no way forward. So that's why we are trying to be there for these families. But it's a very sad situation, because the amount of stress and amount of mental effect this war had, an emotional effect on these individuals who live in these deplorable conditions of war for a long period of time. It's going to take generations for these families, for these kids to heal. So it's very sad picture to see.
Well, on that subject of the long-term recovery, what do you think Ukraine is going to need? What would be your vision, your strategy for that enormous project once it's able to begin?
First of all, we need to have a security in place where Ukraine can know that they're not going to be attacked. So once the borders secured in whatever shape the borders are, I think that's the first step. And then next thing, I do believe we do have to build a big fence to protect ourselves from Russia. The tallest and the biggest fence that's ever been built. Because then I believe we can really start rebuilding the country. Because, we're going to start pouring billions of dollars rebuilding the country, and then you have a crazy neighbor who's shooting down the missiles. So we need to secure perimeters first, and then start rebuilding. I do believe, like, even if you have a fence around Ukraine protecting ourselves from crazy neighbors, we do need to have like a 30-mile buffer zone where no civilians should live, just to protect them from any craziness that can happen. And then after that, I think we would have to start rebuilding infrastructure. I believe the energy infrastructure has to be modernized completely. We have to move away from big centralized power plants and have more smaller, alternative energy plants. Then I do believe that new homes have to be built with the generators, just in case, Russia's try to attack again, and slowly just rebuilding each town at a time, and give an opportunity for these families who lost everything to start their life from the beginning, and provide them also support as far as mental, emotional support, and get money from Russia to pay for everything that has to be rebuilt in Ukraine.
And just finally, Yuriy, thank you for that answer. We've discussed on this podcast now for almost 3 years the waves of support that Ukraine has received by the West. There's been moments where it's received a lot, and then things have slowed down, and then it's received a lot again. And some would say that we're in something of a lull at the moment. But I just wonder, when you're on the ground, do you see the impact of those lulls in terms of the aid, the military situation, in terms of the people that you're helping? I'm just interested in the perspective which global events can actually change the situation on the ground for you over periods of supporting people.
So I can speak to the civilian support for civilians, because 2022 almost every NGO in the world was fundraising for Ukraine, and some of them were in Ukraine. So it was a lot of support. So I think 2022, there was so much different ways the folks could be helped. And now a lot of the NGOs have moved on to different parts of the world. So for organizations like ours that are Ukraine focused, and we basically have to pick up a slack. So a lot of the people who would get help from other sources now, they come to us to get support. So I think that's what we see on the ground as far as the load has been shifted more toward organizations who are still working in Ukraine. And also, I think a lot of population, talking about regular folks, become poorer now. They have spent all their savings. And like I said, in Ukraine back in the day, and it's always been tradition, people used to store food, canned vegetables, stuff like that. They would put in the basements. And then on those kind of supplies, the family could live on for 6 months or 8 months, even if they wouldn't have to go to the grocery store. So right now we see a lot of people, they ran out of everything that they've been storing. So we see many more people need help. I'm talking about basic things like potatoes. And that's why I see especially when politics get involved, it also affects the donations and stuff like that from the regular folks who support causes like ours. Because right now, I'm talking about US, right? So the Ukraine issue has become so politicized. So it's not more like back in 2022. Everybody was looking at this as a humanitarian disaster. Nobody was trying to take sides. Okay, this is my political views. This is now it's been split. So, and that hinders our response in a way. So we basically need to work extra hard as organization now to provide the support to the folks we serve in Ukraine at the same levels as before or increase it. So, of course, I understand that because it's been such a long war, nobody was expecting. I wasn't expecting that right now, 2.5+ years, we're still going to be doing emergency response in Ukraine. I was thinking we would be already in rebuilding mode at this time, but we still in emergency response. So I do understand that a lot of audience on the West, they kind of want to move on past that. But the reality in Ukraine, we cannot move on. We need to stay, because if stay in Ukraine and fight through, because if Ukraine falls, it's going to be terrible for everyone else, especially in Europe. Just as Putin announced, he's trying to build a new world order. The dictators always announce what they're going to do. He did that in 2021 before invading Ukraine. And then now, if, God forbid, Ukraine falls, bad scenario, what can happen next?
Coming up, we hear final thoughts from the team. Well, thanks, Yuriy. We're going to start moving towards the end. We go to final thoughts. Can we go, first of all, please, Roland, for your final thoughts?
Hello, I'll be brief, Dom. And really, I don't have much more to say except to thank Yuriy for that very important description of what it is like for the most vulnerable at the front. And it just reminded me of the many places I've been while reporting, and brought it back, really. I think the message that he just delivered is really, really important. And I've definitely met and seen people. It's always the most vulnerable people, right? It's always the people with nowhere else to go, the people who would always be vulnerable in society, who end up falling through the cracks even more kind of in war, and utterly dependent on this kind of assistance. And as Yuriy was saying, often it seems strange to us when we report it, but to them it is simply the only logical thing, the only answer to that question, why don't you leave? It's like, well, where am I going to go? Literally, I've got no cash. I might as well, stay in a basement in, I don't know, Chasiv Yar or wherever, because those are the options to me. So, Yuriy, thank you for coming on. I think it's a massively important part of the humanitarian aspect of this war that we shouldn't forget. We spend a lot of time talking about geopolitics, which we have this episode, but that very human aspect should always be at the forefront of our minds.
It should indeed. Thanks, Roland. Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Yesterday we were talking about Radio Liberty, or Radio Free Europe as it's sometimes known, and its influence during the Cold War. And I've been thrilled to read listeners' perspectives and memories of the importance of that service during the Cold War. And I just wanted to read a couple of notes from listeners. So from Albert: my grandfather, a member of the Czechoslovak World War II anti-Nazi resistance and an idealist in communism, opposing a lot of its contemporary praxis, used to listen to Radio Liberty and the Voice of America on his shortwave radio all the time, although it was illegal at the time. And from Yana: you asked about experiences with Radio Free Europe during the Cold War era from Eastern European countries. I was born in Czechoslovakia in 1981, so I was still a small child when the Iron Curtain fell. But even as a small child, I remember my parents having old analogue radio in their bedroom, often speaking very silently behind closed doors. They did not want us kids to know. It was dangerous to listen to Radio Free Europe back then. They could have gone to jail for doing so. So they rather did not like telling us, their kids, their neighbours, or even closest friends that they did so. You never knew who will tell the authorities and when the secret police will come to knock on your door. When we later talked about it with my parents, they said that listening to this radio gave their life a certain purpose. Their life was difficult. As non-communists, they were bullied by oppressive communist regime people on a daily basis, threatened to be facing existential problems until the rest of their lives, with the knowledge that their children wouldn't be able to study at any decent school ever, never being allowed to travel to any foreign country, being regularly checked in by the secret police, and so on. It was just a terrible life. But listening to Radio Free Europe gave them hope that things may change one day, that there is someone outside who cares, who can make change happen. Both of my parents were born before the Soviet occupation in Czechoslovakia in 1968 began, and I'm proud of them that they kept that spirit and independence and resistance during that whole period of more than 40 years of occupation. The whole time they had the radio to support them, to provide comfort in difficult times. I'm not sure they could have kept that spirit for that length of time without such support. So yes, I think it's extremely important to have the possibility of access to independent sources of information in places where authoritarian censorship dictates you what you can think. It is extremely irresponsible, therefore, from Apple to remove Radio Free Europe's app from the App Store in Russia. No matter what the justification is, from a moral perspective, it's just wrong. For some people, this radio/app could have been one of the rare possibilities to still keep their hope for a better future in their own language. What a shame to see what's right being replaced by what's more profitable. So thank you, Yana, for that. Thank you also for Albert for your contribution. It is worth remembering that when we talk about negotiations with Russia, that the West would effectively be condemning millions of Ukrainians in the occupied territories to live under the conditions that we just heard there during the Cold War. This is not a hypothetical horror. It happened, and in living memory, and is continuing to this day in those parts of Ukraine that are under the Russian heel. But do please keep your memories coming, folks at home. We love to read them.
Thanks, Francis. Now, Yuriy, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sorry you had to get up early from New Jersey. Thank you very much for introducing us to Hope for Ukraine. As our guest today, would you like the very final thoughts?
So first of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's in UK and all over Europe and around the world who's been standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainian people. The future of Ukraine is bright, and future of all free world is bright. In this dark period of time where we have to fight tyranny and barbarians is going to end, and best is yet to come. That's how I say.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.